Imagine an ancient time where the hills of Ephraim held stories of men and their destinies, a time when the shadows of twilight stretched over a world without kings, without clear laws, where everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. It is in this scenario that we meet a Levite, a man from a tribe dedicated to sacred service, but who now found himself far from the altars, on a quest that had nothing sacred about it. This Levite had taken for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. She was young, full of life, but life alongside the Levite had become a prison for her. The disagreements between them grew, until one day, in a mixture of anger and exhaustion, she ran away. She returned to her father's house in Bethlehem, perhaps seeking refuge, a respite from the rigor that accompanied her. Months passed, and the Levite felt the emptiness left by her absence in every corner of his house, in every lonely moment that passed. He knew he needed to get her. Finally, the Levite made the decision. He would cross the desert trails and fields to Bethlehem. The journey was not easy, but his determination was greater than his fatigue. Arriving at the concubine's father's house, he was received with hospitality, despite the tension still present in the air. The young woman's father, seeing the Levite's arrival, saw an opportunity for reconciliation and welcomed him generously. "Stay another day," the father said each morning, offering food and wine so that the visitor could rest a little longer. The days grew longer, and the concubine, silent, watched the Levite with a distant gaze. He, in turn, tried to read some sign of regret in her gestures, but all he found was a heavy silence. The unspoken words echoed in the Levite's mind, like a shadow that grew with each new day. But time at his father-in-law's house began to take its toll, and the Levite's patience was running out. After 5 days of insistent hospitality, he rose, determined to leave. It was late. The sun was already beginning to decline over the horizon, but the Levite no longer wanted to delay his return home. He would not be deterred by the insistence of the concubine's father, who feared for their safety on the road. "Stay one more night. It's dangerous to travel now," he said. But the decision was made. The Levite placed the concubine and the servant on the donkey, and they began the journey back to the lands of Ephraim. As they rode along the narrow trails, night began to fall upon them. The long shadows of the afternoon were swallowed by a dense darkness, bringing with them the profound silence of the uninhabited lands. It was the kind of darkness that made travelers long for a safe haven, a place where they could escape the threats that loomed under the cover of night. The group approached a city called Gibeah, belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. In that city, they hoped to find a place to rest until dawn. But the contours of Gibeah, in the distance, brought an unsettling sensation, a promise that the night still held surprises that none of them could predict. The late afternoon sky was quickly darkening as the Levite, his concubine, and the servant advanced along the dusty roads of ancient Israel. The three travelers were tired, and darkness was beginning to envelop the hills. Each step of the donkey sounded like an echo in the silence of that land, and the feeling of urgency grew. They needed a safe place to spend the night. The night, at that time, was full of dangers, and they knew it. They finally arrived at the gates of Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin. Upon entering, the Levite felt an initial relief. A city meant shelter, food, security against the threats that lurk in the shadows of the night. But Gibeah had a strange air, like a host who receives visitors with an enigmatic smile. They headed to the town square, a common place for travelers looking for accommodation. They sat there, waiting for someone to offer them a place to rest. The shadows grew thicker, the air colder. The Levite realized that, even after hours, no one approached to offer shelter. This was unusual, as hospitality was a sacred law among the people of that time. As night fell, nervousness set in among the travelers. The Levite observed the surrounding houses, their closed doors and dark windows. Each seemed to hold secrets behind its stone walls. The city, which was supposed to be a safe haven, now seemed shrouded in suspicious darkness. The moon was rising over the horizon, casting a pale light over the square, when, finally, an old man from the fields appeared. His slow steps broke the silence, and he approached the travelers. The old man, realizing the situation, asked them what they were doing there in the square at such a late hour, without shelter. The Levite briefly explained his journey and the search for a place to rest. The old man looked at them with a mix of curiosity and concern, as if he knew something that the newcomers didn't. "Come with me," he said after a moment's hesitation. "It is not safe to stay in the square at night." Those words fell into the air like a warning, a whisper of danger. Without question, the Levite, his concubine, and the servant followed the old man to his home, a modest building that offered a makeshift refuge. Upon entering, the doors were quickly locked, and silence reigned for a moment. The old man offered them food and water, and they accommodated themselves in the small space, trying to catch their breath. But the air around them was filled with an unsettling foreboding, as if the city walls hid a dark truth. As the old man tried to make small talk with the Levite, his eyes frequently went to the door, as if he expected to hear something outside. The travelers noticed this, but said nothing, preferring to cling to the security that the shelter offered, however fragile it was. And then, just as tranquility began to settle in, a noise outside the house broke the peace. They were voices, harsh voices, filled with an intention that left no doubt. The concubine, the Levite, and the servant looked at each other, and the old man immediately walked to the door, trembling. The knocks echoed, loud and impatient, and a biting cold spread through the room. The Levite could hear the men outside demanding that he be handed over to them, a demand that carried with it an implicit but cruel threat. The words exchanged in the darkness between the old man and the men outside made it clear that Gibeah's shadow was deeper than they imagined. The promises of hospitality and protection seemed to slip through the cracks in the door, and the night, which should have been a time of rest, turned into a prelude to something much more terrible. The old man returned, his face pale and his eyes wide. And before they could fully understand the danger that surrounded them, a grim decision began to be made. The dark night, which seemed to be just a promise of rest, now became a nightmare incarnate. The knocking on the door of the old man's house echoed like a drum in the distance, rhythmic with the violence that was felt before it was even seen. Outside, a mob of men from Gibeah gathered, demanding something terrible. They shouted, in rude voices full of malicious intentions, for the Levite to be handed over to them. The night, which should have been one of rest, unfolded into an abyss of darkness. The old man, with his heart racing and his mind boiling with fear, tried to appease the men outside by speaking through the wooden door. "No, my brothers, do not commit this wickedness. This man is my guest. Do not do such a terrible thing," he pleaded, trying to maintain what thread of civility he still had left. But on the other side, the men continued to scream, their demands increasingly cruel, and the shadow of threat grew thicker. Desperate, the old man felt his words being swallowed by emptiness. And then, in a gesture that he hoped would appease the mob's dark desires, he offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine, suggesting that they do whatever they wanted with them, but that they spare the Levite the brutality they intended. The old man's proposal echoed in the small house like a punch in the stomach, a weight that no one there wanted to carry. It was the very idea of hospitality, of protection, that was distorted into something monstrous. The Levite, until then silent, made a cold decision, which carried the weight of 1,000 judgments and no remorse. Without hesitation, he grabbed the concubine and handed her to the men, pushing her towards the terror that awaited her outside. The door closed behind her, sealing the fate between the two sides, the heat and dim light inside the house, the hungry darkness outside. Outside, the concubine was swallowed by the crowd of men, and the night was filled with sounds that should not be heard. The Levite and the old man remained inside the house, protected by the locked door, while the screams of agony echoed in the darkness. The city of Gibeah, which had once seemed to sleep under the stars, was now horribly alive, as if its streets were weighted down by its darkest secrets. The night dragged on, long and endless, each minute more cruel than the last. The moon rose in the sky, indifferently, while the concubine endured suffering that seemed to have no end. And inside, The Levite remained impassive, as if that decision no longer weighed in his hands. The house that was once a refuge now seemed like a prison of silence. Every glance avoided was a silent condemnation. And then, as the first light of morning began to dye the sky a pale hue, the sounds outside stopped. The concubine, exhausted, injured and staggering, dragged herself back to the door of the house where her master was, her body marked by the scars of a night that should never have been. With shaking hands, she reached the door frame, falling there, without even the strength to knock. The Levite finally got up and opened the door. His eyes found the concubine's motionless body on the floor, laid out as a symbol of the horror the night had brought. The expression on his face was indecipherable, but the silence that followed was heavier than any words. He watched her for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, but it wasn't a look of regret, just a look of deep emptiness. He knew that the morning, which was supposed to bring homecoming, now carried a shadow that was impossible to ignore. And so, with the first ray of sunlight hitting the ground, he made a decision that would bring terrible and unforeseen consequences, an action that would transform his personal tragedy into something even greater and more brutal. The silence of the night in Gibeah was thick, heavy, broken only by the threatening murmurs of an angry crowd gathered outside the house. The old man, owner of the shelter, looked with terror at the faces deformed by lust and fury that surrounded his door. His eyes moved restlessly between the Levite, his concubine, and his own daughter, while the hammering on the wood of the door intensified, like a heart about to explode. Then, in an act of desperation, the old man shouted to the crowd, "Please don't do this wicked thing to this man. He is my guest." The terror in his voice was evident, but his next proposal was even more haunting. "Take my virgin daughter and his concubine. Do with them what you want, but don't touch this man." The offer chilled the air, like a soul torn between protecting its guest and sacrificing what was most sacred. The old man, in a fit of despair, offered the unimaginable. For a moment, it seemed like the world stopped. The Levite, motionless, observed the situation with a disturbing coldness. He didn't protest, he didn't defend his concubine, he didn't even try to negotiate. His decision was already made. In a gesture that revealed how deeply he had been consumed by indifference and inhumanity, he pushed his concubine out the door. The silence of the choice weighed more than any words. The door closed with a dull bang, while the grotesque sounds of the crowd outside became more and more distant. She was handed over, without a cry for help, without a last look. Outside, the concubine's fate was sealed, and the viewer is forced to face the shock and horror of such an act. The purity of empathy is destroyed by brutality. Morality is distorted to its limit. The lights in the house dim, the silence expands, as if the city itself is suffocated by the moral darkness that hangs over it. The night lengthens. The muffled sound of violence outside the house creates an unbearable atmosphere, where every minute that passes is an open wound for those who follow this tragedy. Inside the house, the Levite rests, apparently insensitive to the terror he himself caused, as if death and pain had lost their meaning. But when dawn finally breaks, the first rays of sunlight bring with them the raw truth of dawn. The door opens slowly. The darkness of the night seemed eternal. Outside the house, the crowd, which had already revealed its most monstrous side, was about to descend even deeper into cruelty. The concubine, thrown into the clutches of those men, was immediately dragged away. Their screams rent the air, echoing through the sleeping city, but the answer was absolute silence. Inside the house, the Levite remained in his lethargy, as if the screams were just a distant, unimportant noise, unable to penetrate his heart of stone. Outside, darkness enveloped everything. The only thing heavier than the night was the burden of violence, which seemed to increase with each passing minute. The crowd's distorted laughter mixed with the sounds of brutality, creating a symphony of horror that echoed in the shadows. No one came to his rescue. No neighbor, no charitable soul came to stop what was happening. The city of Gibeah, like a mute witness, allowed the savagery to continue, as if the land itself had accepted violence as part of its nature. Hours dragged by, and the night became more and more oppressive, each second carrying an unbearable weight. The concubine, alone, without hope, endured what seemed like an eternity of pain and suffering. Time seemed to lose its shape, and the night, which would one day end, seemed to want to extend forever, as if the darkness itself was conspiring to maintain that endless torture. But then, slowly, the horizon began to brighten. The first signs of dawn appeared, faint and distant, as the city began to awaken. The violence stopped, not out of compassion, but out of exhaustion. The men who had previously given in to their baser instincts now scattered, like wolves running away from the carcass of their prey. The silence that followed was even more distressing than the chaos that had preceded it. That silence carried the gravity of what had happened, as if the world was waiting to exhale the horror it had just witnessed. In the midst of this heavy stillness, the concubine appeared. She staggered, barely able to support herself, her feet dragging on the rough ground, her body marked by a night that had consumed her completely. She crawled, step by step, towards the door where she had been abandoned. His breathing was shallow, his eyes empty, as if the life had been drained from his body and soul. His every movement was a fight against the unbearable pain, against the crushing weight of the night that had just passed. Finally, she reached the door. With trembling hands, he leaned against the cold wood and, without the strength to knock or call, he fell there, at the foot of the house that should have once been his refuge. The silence of the early morning was now broken only by the subtle sound of her weakened breathing, a fragile echo of someone fighting to stay alive. And then, inside the house, the Levite woke up. The sun had barely risen when the Levite opened the door. The first rays of morning illuminated the scene outside, revealing the fragile silhouette of his concubine lying on the floor, leaning against the wood, without the strength to even lift her head. It was there, like a living reminder of the night that should never have happened. His body, motionless, told the story of a brutality that not even screams could fully express. The Levite stopped. His eyes roamed over the concubine's body, now disfigured by the relentless violence of the previous night. The dried blood, the marks of aggression, the pale, cold skin, everything indicated the torment she had gone through. But strangely enough, his face remained unchanged, without a hint of compassion. He showed no surprise, pain, or even anger. His expression was blank, as if the sight before him was simply an inconvenience on his journey home. She, in turn, didn't utter a word. The slow movement of his breathing suggested that there was still life, but it seemed that his soul had been lost somewhere in the early morning. His eyes, half open, looked into space, as if they were already far away from that place. The Levite, indifferent to her condition, did not even bend down to comfort her, nor to check if she was conscious. There was no whisper of affection, no attempt at relief for what she had suffered. Instead, he acted with the same coldness he had shown the night before when he handed her over to the crowd. With mechanical gestures, he lifted her off the ground and placed her on the back of his donkey, as if she were a simple burden to be carried. The scene, terribly silent, was the very image of a tragedy. Not just the tragedy of a woman who had been brutally attacked, but also the tragedy of a man who at some point had completely lost his humanity. As the Levite placed the concubine's inert body on the animal, the city around him began to awaken. The inhabitants of Gibeah, who had slept while the violence took place, now watched from a distance, silently, without interfering. No one questioned, no one offered help. The Levite, in turn, did not seek explanations, nor did he seek justice for what had happened. To him, it seemed like everything was already resolved. The weight of the night before was no longer his to bear. Whatever was left of the concubine was now just a symbol of the chaos he would rather leave behind. With one last look at the city of Gibeah, the Levite reined in the donkey and began walking. His destiny was the same as always, to return home. But in that man's slow and deliberate steps, something much bigger than a simple journey echoed. The silence that accompanied them on the road, punctuated only by the donkey's tired footsteps, seemed to carry the weight of a story that was still far from over. The road before them stretched out in an endless line, but behind them, in the shadows of the city, something sinister was just beginning to emerge. The journey back was silent. The Levite and his inert concubine advanced slowly, with the weight of last night still hanging in the air, like a shadow impossible to dispel. The donkey, now carrying the woman's lifeless body, followed at a mechanical pace, its steps echoing on the dirt path. The Levite, head held high, walked with a blank expression, as if the horror he had witnessed and the death that accompanied it were mere formalities in a larger narrative. Something deeper and more disturbing was about to happen. Upon arriving at his home, the Levite did not offer respectful mourning. There was no crying, there was no ceremony, there was no sign that he recognized the value of the life that had been lost. Instead, he removed his concubine's body from the donkey and laid it on the ground as coldly as he had lifted her hours before. There was no hesitation in his movements. His fixed, determined gaze revealed a mind that had already plotted the next step, a step that would shake the entire nation of Israel. What happened next is difficult to comprehend, but it unfolded with almost ritualistic precision. The Levite took a sharp instrument and, without any words, began to perform the most grotesque and symbolic act of the entire tragedy. He divided his concubine's body into 12 parts, cutting each piece with the calm of one who believes he is performing a solemn duty. Each cut was made with precision. Each division corresponded to one of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was a gesture of horror, but also a message, a silent, blood-soaked rallying call meant to awaken the nation. The dismembered body of his concubine, who had already been a victim of the savagery and cruelty of the men of Gibeah, now became a symbol of an even greater violence, the violence that was about to consume Israel as a whole. The Levite did not see his concubine's body as a person to be remembered, but as a tool, a means of transmitting his version of the story to the tribes, so that they would react with the fury that he himself had chosen not to show. He sent each piece to a tribe, a body part to every corner of Israel. Each tribe received the piece as a call to indignation, a call to war. The horror that spread among the people of Israel was immediate and overwhelming. The tribes, upon seeing the mutilated piece of meat before them, understood the gravity of the situation. There was no need for detailed explanations. The gesture spoke for itself. The dismemberment of the concubine was more than an act of extreme cruelty. It was the spark that would ignite an uncontrollable fire. The tribes of Israel would rise up, overcome by a fury that would be fueled by the memory of the mutilated body. The image of the pieces, sent as a bloody summons, could not be ignored. The consequences of the Levite's act were just beginning to unfold. But as the concubine's body parts were sent to the far reaches of Israel, what really emerged was not just collective outrage, but the shadow of impending war. The sun had not yet reached its peak when the messengers began to arrive, one by one, to the 12 tribes of Israel. Each messenger carried a load wrapped in blood-stained cloth. Silence fell over the squares and fields as the packages were opened, revealing the grotesque, decomposed remains of the concubine. Horror gripped everyone who witnessed that vision. The elders, tribal chiefs, and common folk looked on in astonishment, unable to process what they saw. Those pieces of meat were more than a message. They were a living indictment, a deafening cry of injustice. The outrage was immediate. In every corner of Israel, tribes reacted with fury. How could something like this happen in our land? They murmured. Who would dare commit such an atrocity? Hearts were filled with a mixture of fear and anger. What was once just an unknown town in the territory of Benjamin now became the epicenter of a national tragedy. The air was thick with the foreboding of imminent revenge. The elders and leaders of the tribes called assemblies in all regions. Crowds gathered, eager to hear an explanation of such a barbaric act. And then the Levite arrived. His presence was dark, filled with a calculated and cold air. With a clear and firm voice, he told his version of events, as if it were an account of interrupted justice. The Levite painted a vivid and cruel picture of how the men of Gibeah, of the tribe of Benjamin, surrounded the house where he was staying and, in a brutal attack, raped his concubine to death. He carefully omitted the role he played in handing over his concubine to the crowd. What he narrated was a story of outrage, of a man who had been attacked by forces beyond his control, who had been the victim of unthinkable evil. His tone was calculated, his words chosen to ignite the desire for justice. "What would you do?" he asked, directing his gaze to each tribal leader. "Can this ignominy be tolerated? Can the men of Israel allow such a crime to go unpunished?" The tribes heard the report, and the fury in their hearts began to grow. They felt this was an injustice that could not be left unaddressed. The idea that men of Gibeah, brothers by blood, could commit such a crime, and that the tribe of Benjamin would protect them, was unbearable. The call for revenge was being answered with fervor. Israel, which was once fragmented by differences, now seemed to be uniting around a common goal: to bring justice for the concubine and punish those responsible. Bonfires were lit in the city squares, and the troops began to prepare. The steel of the swords gleamed in the light of the crescent moon, as the leaders of each tribe called their warriors into battle. The march of revenge was about to begin, but as the Levite told his version of events, as the tribes flared with the desire for retaliation, something else was at stake. The quest for justice was turning into an insatiable desire for revenge. The cycle of violence that had begun with the brutality against the concubine was now about to consume an entire tribe. Conflict was fast approaching, and with it, the tragedy promised to deepen even further. The call to war had been made. The fate of Benjamin, and of all Israel, now hung by a thread. The winds of war were beginning to blow with force in Israel. The nation, until then dispersed and divided by its own tribes and interests, now gathered in one place, Mizpah. The news of the heinous crime committed at Gibeah had spread like wildfire, and the Levites' call to justice had brought a fury that inflamed the hearts of every tribe. Leaders, elders, and warriors from across the land rushed to answer the call, eager to confront the shame that had stained their land. The field of Mizpah was full of armed men. Spears and swords gleamed in the sunlight, shields gleamed, and the tribe's flags waved in the wind. Every tribe was present, united by the outrage that the monstrous act of the men of Gibeah had caused. The number was immense, as if all of Israel had risen up in one body to demand justice. But deep down, something darker loomed over the camp. The desire for revenge was growing among the men. The conflict between the search for justice and the thirst for retaliation was on the verge of breaking down. In the center of the assembly, the elders gathered in a tense circle. The smoke from the fires rose into the air, while everyone's eyes were focused on the Levite, who repeated his version of events. His tone was firm, his words carefully chosen to instill fervor in those listening. He spoke about the atrocity that the men of Gibeah had committed, and the nation, with each word, felt its indignation grow even more. The deadly silence that followed the report was broken by the clamor of voices demanding an answer. "We cannot let these men go unpunished," shouted a tribal leader, raising his fist in the air. "Not only did they attack one of our brothers, they violated the sacred laws of hospitality and humanity." His voice echoed among those present, and a chorus of approval followed. Justice was what they sought, or at least that's what they said. But between the lines of the conversation, revenge pulsed like a distant drum. The desire for reparation for the brutalized and dead concubine became increasingly intense. The words of justice were tempered by the heat of fury, and the fine line between the two feelings began to disappear. The tribe of Benjamin, protectors of the men of Gibeah, now stood in the way of this growing wrath, and their refusal to hand over the culprits only increased the tension. The tribes, inflamed by the Levites' narrative, decided that Gibeah would pay for his crimes, and that Benjamin, if he did not cooperate, would also suffer the consequences. The justice they sought, now tainted by the desire for revenge, quickly took the form of civil war. Instead of careful investigation, instead of proportionate punishments, the call was for total destruction. Preparations for the confrontation began almost immediately. Warriors sharpened their swords and adjusted their armor. The leaders discussed strategy, but there wasn't much to debate. Israel's strength was overwhelming, and Benjamin, although proud, was a small tribe in comparison. The scales of justice were about to be tipped, but the weight pushing it was not just the search for redress. It was anger, revenge, and the desire to wash away the stain of Gibeah with blood. With each passing moment, Mizpah's spirit became more tense. What was once a call to justice began to take the form of a brutal desire for retaliation, a fratricidal war that seemed inevitable. The fires in the camp of Israel burned more intensely, as if they sensed what was to come. And then, at the decisive moment, Israel decided. The ultimatum was sent to Benjamin: surrender the men of Gibeah, or face the wrath of the entire nation. The stage was set, and the impending battle no longer seemed to be about justice. It was about revenge. The drums of war began to beat, and the fate of an entire tribe was about to be decided. The tribes of Israel, moved by indignation and fury, had made a clear and direct requirement to the tribe of Benjamin: deliver the men responsible for atrocity in Gibeah. The crime committed against Levite's concubine was more than an act of savagery. It was an affront to the pact that kept the united tribes. Now Israel expected an answer, but what they received in return was a deafening silence. Benjamin, instead of giving in to the pressure of his sister tribes, made a decision that would cast the country into a devastating war. The Benjamites refused to deliver the culprits. They would protect their men, even though it would mean that this would mean challenging the rest of Israel. For them, the loyalty to theirs was unbreakable. Even if these men were responsible for an abominable crime, the honor of the tribe was more important. If they delivered the culprits, it would be to admit weakness before the other tribes. It would be to give in to external pressure. And this was a humiliation that Benjamin was not willing to accept. The refusal was clear. They would protect Gibeah, no matter the cost. The news of this decision spread quickly throughout the Israeli camp in Mizpah. The weather was already tense, but now there was a palpable feeling that war was inevitable. The initial desire for justice, who had united the tribes against the savagery in Gibeah, was beginning to be overshadowed by something darker: the thirst for revenge. Benjamin's refusal was seen as a direct challenge. For Israel, it was not just about punishing the men of Gibeah. Now it was a matter of pride. Benjamin's resistance could not be tolerated. The elders and leaders of Israel, who once sought a fair solution, now gathered in war advice. Levite, whose history had started this current of events, remained as a central figure, but now the issue had come out of his hands. Israel's own destiny was at stake. War was no longer about a specific crime. It was about the unity and authority of the tribes itself. If Benjamin could challenge the rest of Israel, which would prevent other tribes from doing the same in the future. While the tribes of Israel prepared for battle, Benjamin was also armed. The warriors of Benjamin, aware that their refusal would put them against the rest of Israel, began to organize. Each man knew that by protecting the culprits from Gibeah, he was putting his life at risk. But the honor and pride of the tribe were more important than any of them. The battlefield was beginning to form. The tribes of Israel, united by their collective fury, prepared to march against their own brothers. Benjamin, small but fierce in his defense, knew he was at a disadvantage. Even so, I would rather fight and resist submitting. The confrontation between Israel and Benjamin, between justice and blind loyalty, was about to happen. The swords were laid down, and the fate of an entire nation was about to be decided in a fratricidal conflict, where the only certainty was the devastation it would follow. The battlefield, once just a scenario for debates and discussions, now became the stage of a fratricidal war. The tribes of Israel, united by their indignation, advanced against Benjamin with relentless force. On the one hand, the thousands of Israel warriors, enraged by Benjamin's refusal to deliver Gibeah's culprits. On the other, the tribe of Benjamin, smaller but determined to fight to the end of the honor of protecting their own. What began as a request for justice now became a devastating conflict between brothers. The first onslaught was fast and brutal. The tribes of Israel, with their higher number, seemed intended for a quick victory. But the Benjamites, known for their combat ability, resisted surprising ferocity. His pride and determination pushed them beyond their limits. And in the first battles, they managed to inflict heavy blows in Israel. Benjamin warriors, especially archers and backshooters, were relentless, and their skills allowed them to hold on to advance the tribes for a while. But the weight of Israel's forces was overwhelming. With each passing day, the losses accumulated on both sides. The battlefields were covered by the bodies of men who, days before, were brothers under the same alliance. The spilled blood spotted the land of Israel, while the cycle of violence, which began by the crime in Gibeah, grew in a spiral out of control. The initial desire for justice became an insatiable hunger for revenge, and the battle, which should be a limited punishment, quickly turned into a massacre. Benjamin's resistance, although brave, began to weaken. Surrounded by larger and more numerous tribes, the tribe began to give ground. The forces of Israel, which had previously been surprised by the strength of the Benjamites, now advanced with more strategy and fury. Once Gibeah's walls were knocked down, the chaos spread. The battle has become a carnage, and the death toll grew exponentially. In the midst of smoke and blood, which was once a war between brothers, became a massacre. Israel's sword spared no one, and the number of dead in Benjamin rapidly increased. The people, who previously proud of their strength and resistance, were now on the verge of extinction. The massacre was total. Men, women, and children of Benjamin were hunted and killed without mercy. The pride that had led them to resist now dragged them into an almost complete annihilation. When dust finally lowered, reality was devastating. Benjamin's tribe, once a vibrant part of Israel, was almost extinct. Only a handful of men had survived the carnage. The cycle of violence that began with the crime in Gibeah now became a national tragedy, with consequences that would echo generations. Revenge, which was the engine behind the conflict, had consumed everything around him, and the price paid by Israel was unbearably high. The tribes of Israel, in a mixture of victory and regret, looked at what they had done. The destruction they had caused to their own flesh and blood was something that could not be undone. What should have been an act of justice had become a national tragedy. The almost decimated Benjamin tribe now represented the final price of a cycle of violence that began with a brutality act, but ended in a massacre that almost erased an entire tribe from Israel's face. And as the sun was on the spotted fields of blood, the silence that took over the scenery was the only echo of a war that, though finished, left a nation irreparably marked by pain and loss. The war was over, but the trail of destruction it had left behind was immeasurable. What was left of Benjamin's tribe were only 600 men, hidden in the desert caves, survivors of a massacre that almost extinguished them. The tribes of Israel, in a mixture of victory and repentance, looked at the wreckage they had caused. The act of revenge, which began with the indignation justified by the atrocity in Gibeah, had resulted in something much larger and more tragic: the almost complete annihilation of a sister tribe. But the awareness of what had been done soon began to weigh on Israel. What should be an exemplary punishment had become a brutal massacre. Now the people of Israel faced the harsh reality that one of their 12 tribes was on the verge of disappearance. And this, in a society deeply marked by tribal inheritance, was an almost unbearable blow. Benjamin's future, and with him the balance of the tribes, was at risk. Repentance began to spread among the leaders of Israel. They realized that in their zeal for justice they had gone too far. The tribes who once united to punish evil now were facing an irreparable loss. In an effort to remedy what seemed irreversible, they made a pact to restore Benjamin's tribe, seeking ways to ensure that the few survivors could rebuild their lineage. However, the solution they found involved new acts of violence and kidnapping, perpetuating the dark cycle of their choices. The marks of war, violence, and revenge were deeply recorded in Israel. Each village, each family, felt the weight of the tragedy they witnessed. Benjamin's massacre was a constant reminder of what unbridled fury and the desire for retribution can cause. Benjamin's restoration, although necessary, was incomplete. The tribe, even being spared from extinction, would never be the same. In the center of everything, the memory of the concubine, whose suffering and death had started this current of events, remained. Although it was no longer mentioned directly, its echo was palpable. Its history, a symbol of violence and inhumanity, continued to reverberate in the minds of the people. She had become a silent and tragic figure, a dark memory of the consequences of cruelty and unbridled revenge. In the end, Israel was fragmented, not only for their physical losses, but for a moral and spiritual wound that would never be completely healed. What was left was a nation in mourning, trying to gather the pieces of a unit that, although still existing, would never be the same again. Benjamin's fate had been preserved, but the nation as a whole was deeply marked by what he had done.